So, ну, я думаю, что если мы будем, все-таки у нас лекция будет по-английски, и поэтому давайте все-таки перейдем на английский. Вот. В силу, значит, как бы здесь нужно выбрать один из языков. Ну, я думаю, что английский ни для кого не представит сложности. So, it's my pleasure and great honor to introduce to you Professor Rичард Фольц, who now works at the Department of Religions and Cultures at Concordia University in Montreal, in Canada. Professor Foltz defended his PhD thesis in Middle Eastern history at Harvard University in the USA, and since that time has been working in numerous universities in the New World and in the Old World. Professor Foltz has authored 10 books and more than 100 scholarly articles. He profoundly contributed to the contemporary Iranian studies, writing on religion and culture of Zoroastrian Iran, Islamic Iran, and also contemporary culture and politics of the Iranian world. It must be noted that Professor Foltz introduced a series of new subjects and new themes in the world, in the international scholarship. In particular, I would like to mention his problematization of the topic of the attitude to animals, say in ancient Iranian and Islamic medieval culture, and also the attitude to ecology, to ecological imagination of the medieval Near East. It's actually it's very important because nobody tried to find such a topic in medieval and ancient sources. So this is why his works are very much appreciated in the West, and not only in the West but also in Iran as well. Many of his books have been translated into Persian, and Professor Foltz is lecturing extensively in Iran. Is quite frequent there. So, and I would like also to stress that Professor Foltz has a special ability to put very quite complicated topics and problems into comprehensible, simple words, just understandable for many educated persons. Okay, so and his latest big work describes Tajik culture from the very beginning, from the ancient times up to contemporary politics. And the book, probably you have seen the title of the book, A History of the Tajiks, Iranians of the East, which has come out just recently in I.B. Tauri's publishing house, one of the best in the field of Oriental scholarship. So, so let us. This book is the first book about Tajikistan, which has been written in a Western language, actually, because we have in Russian some texts just observing the Tajik history in general. We have in Tajik some texts in Persian, but not in any of the Western languages. Professor Foltz, welcome to the Moscow University. So, can we ask you to start your talk?
Sorry, go ahead.
Okay.
Я хотел бы поблагодарить вас всех за то, что вы здесь, и особенно моего хорошего друга Рустама Шукурова, который любезно пригласил меня быть с вами здесь сегодня. Я надеюсь, что вы простите меня, если я продолжу на английском. The fate of the USSR was sealed by an abortive coup in August 1991, after which the union that had endured for more than 7 decades was widely seen as no longer viable. One by one, the republics declared their independence, with Tajikistan reluctantly bringing up the rear on 9th of September, following the resignation of Tajik Communist Party leader Kahar Makhramov. The Tajiks had now achieved sovereignty for the first time since the fall of the Samanid dynasty in 999, nearly 1,000 years earlier. Unfortunately, the result of this newfound self-rule, a freedom, in the words of one scholar, more forced on them than acquired or won, was a rapid slide into several years of brutal internal conflict. The Tajik Civil War, which lasted from 1992 to 1997, has most often been portrayed as a struggle between the old guard, who were raised as communists, versus a newly emerged Islamist opposition. This trope has been taken up by the Soviet successor regimes in all the former republics of the USSR, where Muslims constitute a significant proportion of the population, and has served for more than 25 years now to justify all manner of autocratic abuses and the stifling of human rights on the pretext of fighting against Islamic extremism, a kind of fear-mongering that has garnered much in the way of uncritical support from Western democracies. In fact, the crisis in Tajikistan, the roots of which were already present during the Gorbachev years, had more to do with competition among rival elites, often region-based, within the existing Soviet system. Angry public demonstrations and street gang hooliganism were definitely present, along with mostly vague calls for a revalorization of the Islamic components of Tajik identity. But these public agitations were more often either orchestrated or co-opted by elite actors to promote their immediate agendas. Tajikistan's 80% poverty rate was a major factor, in that many Tajiks saw civil disorder not as a means to political ends, but simply as a cover for obtaining food and goods through looting. The regional divisions so apparent during the Tajik Civil War served to highlight the fact that the Soviet system had failed to instill in the population any kind of strong, unifying national identity as Tajiks. Moreover, during the years immediately before and after independence, Tajik intellectuals, both in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, were focused largely on the question of reattaching Samarkand and Bukhara to Tajikistan. This dream did not come to fruition, a setback that may have owed something to Uzbekistan's intervention in the Tajik Civil War. Ironically, the Uzbeks, and particularly their late president Islam Karimov, were instrumental in consolidating the power of Tajik President Imam Ali Rahman as the savior of the nation and the bringer of peace, though in reality this peace owed more to UN mediation and compromises agreed to by the united Tajik opposition. After that time, for many years, Rahman portrayed the Uzbek state as an enemy, standing in the way of Tajik national integrity, which requires a repossession of the occupied cities of Samarkand and Bukhara. The construction and propagation of Tajik identity, undertaken by Rahman, relying heavily on the interpretations of Babajan Gafurov, Rahim Massoud, Yusuf Shah Yakubov, and other nationalist historians, sought to portray the Samanid Empire of the 9th and 10th centuries as the foundational Tajik state, with Ismail Samani as its founding figure. It may be noted that this claim stands up far better to historical scrutiny than the parallel project taking place in neighboring Uzbekistan, wherein Amir Timur was touted as the father of the Uzbek nation, an attribution that has demanded considerable manipulation of the historical sources. As in most of the other former Soviet republics, Tajikistan's nation-building initiative has entailed frequent government-sponsored celebrations of historical periods and figures presented as essential to Tajik identity. To that end, President Rahman declared 1999 to be the 1,100th anniversary of the Samanid Empire. To mark the occasion, a massive statue of Ismail Samani was erected in Dushanbe's Lenin Square, now renamed Ismail Samani Square, where it stands today. By identifying itself so closely with the Samanids, Tajikistan has implicitly affirmed its claims to all the territories occupied by the Samanid state, including its capital cities, Bukhara and Samarkand. During the 1990s and early 2000s, Rahman also promoted a pre-Islamic Aryan Zoroastrian Tajik identity. With an arbitrary disregard for scholarly debates on the time and homeland of Zarathustra, the Tajik president designated the year 2003 as the 3,000th year of Zoroastrian culture, an initiative that gained the approval and support of UNESCO. Rahman makes frequent mention of Zoroastrianism in his book, Tajiks and Their Ancestors. My thoughts go back to Zarathustra, he wistfully recalls, who created the immortal Avesta, the first prophet of the Tajiks, whose trace on earth has not been erased by the dust of millennia and the ashes left by countless bloody wars. After several years, it became apparent that these attempts to foreground the Tajiks' pre-Islamic heritage had backfired, and that by contrast, many Tajiks were instead rediscovering Islam. Tajikistan Today offers few opportunities for young people starting out in life, even those with university educations. For those who have only completed high school, the prospects are even worse. In the words of a young middle-class man who left school at age 16, in Tajikistan nowadays there are no choices. If you want to go to university, you have to bribe teachers to get a place. If you have a diploma and want to get a job, you need to pay corrupt officials. Corruption is everywhere. Facing such despairing conditions, many are seduced by the promises and sense of purpose and belonging offered by radical Islamic organizations such as Hezb Tahrir or even the Al-Qaeda-affiliated Islamic movement of Uzbekistan. The IMU, based in Pakistan and Afghanistan, has launched several incursions into Tajik territory in recent years. Following the outlawing of the Islamic Renaissance Party of Tajikistan in 2015, 14 IRPT leaders were jailed, 2 of them given life terms. IRPT chairman Mohiuddin Kabiri, now living in exile, predicts that the government crackdown on Islamism will play into the hands of radicals, and more youths, having lost all trust in the government, will join the ranks of extremist groups. Tajik men have become subject to a de facto beard ban, beards being perceived as a symbol of Islamist sympathies, with reports of police beating bearded men and some individuals taken off to be shaven by force. The government has also been pressuring women not to wear hijab, clamping down on halal restaurants for violating the rights of alcohol drinkers, and banning Islamic components of personal names, such as Haji, Sheikh, Mullah, etc., on the basis that they create class discrimination. Officially, these measures are claimed to be anti-extremist, not anti-Islam. Having failed to make a positive impression with its earlier pre-Islamic propaganda, over the past decade, the strategy of the Tajik government has been to promote acceptable Islam based on the Hanafi legal tradition. Accordingly, 2009 was declared the year of Imam-e-Azam, Abu Hanifa, the founder of the world's most widely practiced school of Islamic jurisprudence, and the following year, Dushanbe was declared a capital of Islamic culture. Concomitant with this effort to bring Islam into the nationalist project, the Tajik government began to exercise more control over religious discourse through the appointment of officially sanctioned religious leaders. Tolerated Islam is increasingly restricted to that which operates within state-approved institutions, such as the Department of Religious Affairs and the Islamic Center, with its High Council of Ulama, which was established in 2009 to replace the Qaziyat as the country's most important official Islamic institution. This represents a clear effort on the part of the Tajik government to co-opt Islam away from the opposition and from extremist groups such as Hezb Tahrir. The promotion of traditional Hanafi Islam, as opposed to the interpretations of HT and other radical groups, as integral to authentic Tajik national identity, has been prominent in the work of Islamic scholar turned politician Akbar Turajanzadeh, notably in his 2007 book, Sharia and Society. Erecting monumental structures has been another aspect of Tajikistan's national identity building project. The flagpole looming above central Dushanbe was for several years the world's tallest, until a taller one, built by Turks, was erected in Tunis. The flag is not far from the new National Library, the largest in Central Asia, which faces the statue of Ismail Somani in Freedom Square. The library was opened in 2011, but the collections were initially quite meager and had to be enhanced by forcing academics to donate their personal book collections. When I stopped in to offer a copy of one of my own published books, a puzzled cataloger asked me why I was donating only one book. What is promised to be Central Asia's largest mosque is currently being built in Dushanbe with Qatari money. Qatari real estate firms have also invested heavily in building palatial residential complexes all across the capital, dramatically changing the face of the city. Designed to accommodate 115,000 worshippers at a time, the mosque complex has an estimated price tag of $100 million. President Rahman initiated the construction by ceremoniously donning a hard hat and taking over the controls of a bulldozer at the building site on October 5, 2011, his own birthday. But since long before this mosque initiative was first announced in 2009, the most symbolically significant national building project has been the construction of the Rogun Dam on the upper Vakhsh River east of Dushanbe. Originally conceived during the Soviet period for the dual purposes of irrigation and hydroelectricity, the project has been plagued by delays, and just recently construction was put on hold. If the dam is ever completed, it will reach a height of 335 meters, making it the tallest dam in the world. The Rogun project has been riddled with controversy, however, its critics claiming that it is financially impractical and technologically obsolete. It has moreover been a source of political tension with downstream Uzbekistan, which fears the vulnerability of its own precious water resources, the Vakhsh being a major tributary to the Amu Darya. When the Tajik government sought to raise funds for the project by making an IPO in 2010, citizens were forcibly made into shareholders through payroll deductions, and students had to show proof of owning shares before being allowed to take their exams. In recent years, efforts to develop a personality cult around the president have accelerated, with massive portraits adorning the exterior walls of every building and huge billboards beside every stretch of road. The overwhelming proliferation of these public images, with their accompanying slogans enjoining peace, unity, and reconciliation, surpasses even what could be seen during the Soviet period. Artistically speaking, they are quite tacky, and the slogans and platitudes, such as "language is the wellspring of the nation," or "the youth are the future of our country," etc., are all signed by the president as if they were somehow original proclamations, but they seem hardly inspirational. Still, they seem to be having an effect among school children, who are perhaps their principal intended audience. Since the breakup of the Soviet Union, Tajikistan has been one of the few countries in the world to see an increase in poverty. Given that it was already the poorest republic in the USSR, this trend is deeply discouraging. What industry the republic possessed in Soviet times was severely crippled by the civil war following independence, during which it logged a negative GDP, with industrial production dropping by 80%. And apart from hydropower and cotton, Tajikistan produces little on its own that can be exported. Aluminium smelted at the Talco factory outside the western city of Tursunzada, which currently accounts for 60% of Tajikistan's exports, has to be imported from other countries since it is not mined domestically. This single government-owned operation consumes 40% of the national supply of electricity, even as power cuts and energy rationing remain a frequent fact of life for the general population. The agricultural sector, where 2/3 of Tajikistan's remaining workers are employed, has not recovered from the removal of Soviet-era subsidies or the ravages of the Civil War. Collective farms were nominally privatized into workers' cooperatives by 1999, but any structural changes were superficial. Machinery, seeds, and water access fell under the control of monopolists having government connections, while border issues with Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan have restricted Tajiks farmers' ability to export their produce to foreign markets. The mass migration of 1 million or more working-age men to Russia and other neighboring countries has left a labor shortage in rural parts of Tajikistan, where women are left to fill the gap. Since deeds to land parcels are generally in the name of the male head of the household, women whose husbands are working abroad are often left legally vulnerable. Cotton continues to provide the major source of agricultural revenue to the state, with apples being a distant second. Even so, cotton yields in Tajikistan are less than half what they were during the late Soviet period. Being an extremely water-intensive crop, cotton production uses up the lion's share of the country's water resources, as was the case during the Soviet period. The irrigation system, vital in Tajikistan's arid climate, has been subject to damage from earthquakes, and pumps have been underused because they are run on petroleum, which is expensive and has to be imported. The cotton monoculture limits the availability of land, water, and labor resources from being used for food production. In 1995, the International Monetary Fund insisted that Tajikistan stop the state funding of agriculture as a condition for receiving IMF loans. Yet it took 13 years for the IMF to realize that the Tajik government had continued secretly to fund the cotton industry, which had nevertheless somehow managed to accrue a debt of $500 million US. Yet according to one analyst, the farm debt is mostly fictitious. State power has been systematically used to dominate the farms. Their nominal privatization has provided a convenient cover for exploitation of the rural population to benefit a small elite, creating a case study of post-Soviet crony capitalism. Tajikistan has some aspects of a narco-state. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that about 1/3 of Afghanistan's opium production, some 90 tons per year, transit through Tajikistan, enriching Tajik criminal gangs and numerous corrupt government officials. Drug trafficking has been estimated to constitute anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of the country's annual GNP. The state has often appeared to be directly involved in protecting and facilitating the transit of drugs through the country, while Western governments and NGOs, not wishing to jeopardize their alliance with the Tajik government in combating Islamists, turn a blind eye. Numerous high-ranking government figures, including diplomats and even drug enforcement officials, have been involved in the drug trade. Noting the surprisingly large numbers of luxury vehicles seen on the streets of the capital, one European aid worker remarked to The Economist, "We give them cars, and they use them to transit drugs." And as a Tajik journalist told the Los Angeles Times, "If someone's got a good house or a good car, that means he's a bandit dealing narcotics, because you can't buy a car on $30 a month." Most of the smuggling is believed to take place across legal border crossings from Afghanistan, making use of roads and bridges built with millions of dollars in US assistance since 2001. With drug seizures steadily declining every year, Western-devised sting operations tend to focus on small-time operators, thus inadvertently removing the competition on behalf of major traffickers. Ironically, this has helped to reduce drug-related violence and to ensure stability in Tajikistan, in contrast to many other narco states. Though most Afghan heroin passing through Tajikistan is destined for Russia and the West, local consumption has risen dramatically, and the country now counts tens of thousands of addicts. Apart from exacerbating the problem of widespread criminality, the proliferation of drug abuse has led to an epidemic of HIV among intravenous users. Still, the attitude of many Tajiks towards the reality of the drug trade in their country is somewhat resigned, pointing out that given their proximity to the sources of opium production in lawless Afghanistan and their own economic and social connections with Russia, which constitutes such a huge market for illicit drugs, some Tajiks are inclined to see their government's participation in trafficking as a kind of tax on an activity that is going to take place whether they like it or not. The border between Tajikistan and Afghanistan along the Panj River, which bisects Badakhshan, is effectively unguarded. Fences installed during the Soviet period were taken down after independence to be recycled as building materials. The river is only a few meters wide in places and could be easily waded across. But when I mentioned this to my Tajik hosts, they simply laughed and said, "There's no reason to get wet when you can smuggle anything you want through the official border posts." Sour relations between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, fueled by the former country's irredentist claims to Samarkand and Bukhara, have made the situation of Uzbekistan's Tajiks particularly difficult. Tajik President Rahman has referred to the Uzbek rulers of these Tajik majority cities as enemies of the Tajik nation. And on 2 occasions, he got into fistfights with the late Uzbek President Islam Karimov. Once I was with Karimov in Samarkand, Rahman recalled in an interview. I asked a man standing next to us, "Who are you by nationality?" He looked at Karimov, but I saw his fear, and he answered, "I'm from Samarkand." This is today's situation with Tajiks there. Many Tajiks in Uzbekistan have taken to calling themselves Iranians, as a way of asserting a distinct identity within Uzbek society without raising the anger of the authorities. An estimated 70,000 Tajiks living in Soh, a 350 square kilometer enclave in Kyrgyzstan's portion of the southern Fergana Valley, are in a sense doubly cut off. Geographically, by the Kyrgyz territory that surrounds them, as well as politically, since the enclave belongs to Uzbekistan. As in the neighboring enclave of Vorukh, which belongs to Tajikistan, the population of Soh is almost entirely Tajik. In January 2013, a group of Soh Tajiks attacked Kyrgyz border guards who were trying to set up electrical poles within Soh territory. The Tajik rioters then spilled over into a neighboring Kyrgyz village where they beat up residents, overturned cars, and took dozens of hostages. The Uzbek government responded by closing the borders, leaving Soh residents without access to food or other supplies until the conflict was resolved nearly a month later. Kyrgyz transport was disrupted as well, since the roads connecting the cities of Osh and Batken, with typical Soviet-era disregard for republic boundaries, passed through Soh. Prior to the breakup of the Soviet Union, the Tajik SSR was the most dependent on economic transfers from the center of any Union republic, as much as 45% of the total annual budget. The disappearance of these important subsidies created a severe financial crisis for independent Tajikistan, which certainly played some part in the political crisis that led to the Civil War. It bears repeating that while at the level of the elites, the war was largely a competition for power, for most ordinary participants on the ground, it was about such basic issues as securing food for one's extended family. In the post-war years, external subsidies took on a new form, as up to 1 million Tajiks per year, mostly men, began taking up seasonal work abroad, mostly in Russia and Kazakhstan, as a way of supporting their families back in Tajikistan. The Tajik economy is more dependent on labor migration than any country in the world, another sad superlative for this impoverished nation. Remittances from abroad now account for more than half of Tajikistan's GNP, essentially replacing one form of economic dependence on Russia with another. Combining this figure with that generated by the drug trade, it becomes apparent that the legitimate economic output of Tajikistan today is negligible indeed. And one wonders how its people could survive if these two sources were not keeping the nation's economy afloat. Tajik migrant workers in Russia fill the lowest professional niches: stall vendors, waiters, stevedores, car wash attendants, and construction workers. In 2016, a reporter for The Guardian interviewed a former medical doctor, now working as a bathroom attendant, earning far more than he did as a physician practicing in Tajikistan. Russian visa restrictions have recently been tightened, forcing Tajik laborers to leave the country every 3 months to have them renewed. Police harassment is a way of life. One effect of so many Tajik men moving to Russia in search of work is that whether or not they have wives back home, they often develop relationships with Russian women. Freed from the pressures they would typically experience from their families in Tajikistan, migrant workers living abroad are more likely to have relationships that are based on love and shared interests. They may start families to which they become more attached than to those they have left behind in Tajikistan. Needless to say, this kind of situation can cause a whole range of problems for everyone concerned. Usually, however, such families in Tajikistan are dependent on the migrant worker for financial support, so their capacity to control or sanction him is limited. Conversely, in Russia, Tajik men may be at the mercy of their Russian female partners in order to obtain legal residence, for example, in ways that force them to change their familiar gender roles. They may learn to share in household chores and are unlikely to be able to control their Russian partner's movements and social behavior the way they would in the case of a Tajik woman. When visiting their families back in Tajikistan, however, they typically revert to their traditional norms, even when dealing with the Tajik wife they may have left there. Young women in Tajikistan, meanwhile, are left with a lack of prospective husbands. Some elect to become second wives to men who can afford them, an option they see as preferable to remaining unmarried. When marriages can be arranged with migrant workers living abroad, they are sometimes conducted via Skype. Similarly, the appearance of SMS divorces, whereby distant husbands rid themselves of unwanted financial responsibility simply by sending the text message talaq, 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 prompted Tajik religious authorities to issue fatwas condemning this practice. But since many Tajik marriages are performed only Islamically and remain officially unregistered, divorcees in this situation can find no protection under Tajik law. An estimated 95% of all divorces are initiated by the husband, and many Tajik women are unaware that they have any right to support. Even for those that do, migrant laborers living abroad often have no fixed address, and it can be difficult for their wives to find them. Notwithstanding the cheery tone of the Tajik government's public propaganda, it is difficult for an outside observer to be optimistic about the country's future, at least in the short term. Tajikistan is plagued by numerous problems, not the least of which are the old bugbears of poverty and unemployment. Those with decision-making power have failed to provide the younger generation with either hope for a rewarding career or a sense of national belonging. And many are turning to radical Islam for an alternative sense of purpose in life. The paternalistic character of the Tajik government seems geared towards maintaining the population in an infantile state of dependence, rather than equipping them with the means to become thinking, empowered global citizens. Tajiks are heirs to one of the world's great civilizations, but this fact has been ineffectively utilized as a resource for strengthening their sense of pride in their history and place in the world. Official efforts to muster this national pride have largely backfired. The fact that the entire Iranian world, from the Islamic Republic of Iran to Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, continues to chafe under authoritarian leadership, does little to foster a sense of unity or pride in a broader Iranian heritage. It serves rather to maintain a feeling of separateness and isolation from each other and from the global community as a whole. Tajikistan's economy shows few signs of improvement. Its industries are mismanaged and cannot compete internationally. Simply building a large hydroelectric dam will not be sufficient to remedy the country's economic problems. Tajiks, by and large, were better off under the Soviet system, but nostalgia for that ever more distant past will not help them now. Worse, newly global standards of comparison have raised their expectations to levels that their present circumstances can never meet, as images from around the world purport to show them everything that they're missing. On the other hand, as an ancient people, Tajiks have shown an impressive historical resilience. They have faced far worse times than what they are living through today and survived. The late Uzbek president Islam Karimov, who some might consider a treasonous Tajik in disguise, used to like to say that a nation possessing a great past will also have a great future. Perhaps the Tajiks, whose historical legacy can stand proud against any the world has to offer, have that to look forward to. They may just have to wait a while. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Foltz, for your concise and at the same time quite deep profound analysis of contemporary Tajik society. So, is there any question from the audience? So, please.
May I? Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity, first of all. Really deep gratitude, yes. Because the initiative actually to present Tajiks outside of Tajikistan, it's a kind of, it is a huge task. And I just feel, today I feel like a kind of representative of sad nation, to be honest. Quite a desperate situation. It's happened that because I'm from Tajikistan originally, I'm Tajik, until very, to present Tajikistan, it is very complicated picture, but just one question with regard of probably the name of the book. Because when news got me about Tajiks as Iranians of the East, the first question I was like, wow, that's cool. That's something very, it's not unusual, absolutely, because in Samarkand, they sometimes from time to time, they just still keep presenting Tajiks as Iranians still. And to me, it reminds me very much, and Professor Shukuru probably agreed with me, that your father, Professor Shakuri, used to talk about this idea of being Tajik with a less probably Eurocentric view of, yes, Tajiks themselves. Because his couple of his research about Jadidism and how to present Tajiks with, again, less European accent. To me, it was a kind of new discovery or new approach toward Tajiks. And suddenly when I realized that we, again, from every time when we repeat that Tajiks do have Asian history, they do have roots from Samanid, to me it's a kind of historical a priori that happened that Michel Foucault proposed. Here we take it and we just put our a priori towards Samani and declare them Tajiks. Do you think it would be right to say that Samanids probably it's a more mosaic picture that happened that time, and it's again not contemporary Tajiks that again have any kind of relation to those Samanids? It's a first. I'm sorry, it's a kind of remark that I was just thinking about contemporary situation. You are definitely 95% that you are right about Tajiks and complicated situation. But I was thinking, any positive sign? Did you? It's happened to us? Anything that you just find, wow, that's really interesting from Tajik side? Okay, just
well, I'm in a way sorry to have given you such a sad story today, because it's just the end of my book, and my book starts 4,000 years ago, and almost the whole book is really, really positive. It's talking about the great things that the Tajiks have in their history to be proud of, and the enormous contributions to world history. And I offered Professor Shakurov a choice of 3 different topics, and he said he thought that, or the department thought that a contemporary topic would have the most interest. So if that's true, and if you're interested in contemporary issues primarily, then I'm afraid the story is not a happy story. But if you are interested in history, and this is a history department after all, then I hope that one day you might have the chance to have a look at the rest of the book, which talks about the Tajiks' very long history and the very rich contributions of Tajik culture. So there is hope.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Well, you know, as we all know from our own lives, there are ups and downs, right? So, whenever you're down, I suppose you need to remind yourself that things are going to get better.
Just very, very small remarks. I'm sorry for taking your time, just because to me, the title of the book, Iranians of the East, again remind me that talk that happened in 20s about, yes, how to present Tajiks. Tajiks, are they Iranians or are they something else? And I was just thinking, right now in Tajikistan we have very similar situation. Right now we're just trying to figure out what does it mean to be Tajik.
Mm-hmm.
And when we just every time stress on a kind of Iranian context, again ignoring our own context, and synthesizing Persian and Turkish, it's happened that again, it's happened in our land. And every time when we just say that, by the way, just very recently got back from Bukhara, where we had a very interesting workshop with people from West. And again, I just discovered myself at a kind of alone because I'm trying to say, hello people, we're just simply not very European nation. We're just simply different. That's the way, I'm sorry, yes, just my very small remarks.
Would you like my opinion?
Yes.
It's just my humble personal thoughts, but yes, the subtitle of the book, I think, is the key to why I wrote it. Going back to when I was a PhD student in the 90s, and I lived in Samarkand for a time, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation in the end on making the case for a unified Asian Muslim society between Iran, India, and Central Asia, that in many ways it was a unified culture, and that the divisions that we're used to talking about now, the Middle East, South Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, Central Asia, these divisions are the result of the experience of European colonialism. It was the Russians and the British carving out Eurasia for themselves. And sadly, one of the legacies of post-colonialism is that most of the new nation states have adopted and perpetuated the European model of nationalist thinking and nation-state thinking, which really is not at all compatible. Even in Europe, it had to be applied by force. I mean, Italy and Germany didn't become countries until the late 19th century. France became a country because Napoleon went around forcing everybody to be French, you know. So it was not an easy process for Europeans either. And it goes against, I mean, look at what happened much more recently in the Balkans. You have people living together, but then, you know, you impose this nation-state ideology and it causes a lot of bloodshed. So I don't think that this is in the benefit of people to accept and to perpetuate this kind of divisive thinking. So if we talk about this very great Asian Muslim civilization, which endured for more than 1,000 years, one of the components of it was that Persian was the elite literary and administrative language. Doesn't mean that everybody was Iranian, but the Persian language was a major feature of this civilization. So that even in British India, a Hindu from Bengal who wanted to get a government job had to learn Persian. You know, we have chairs in Persian at Oxford and Cambridge because in the 19th century, if you were a young Englishman and you wanted to get a government job, you had to go to Oxford or Cambridge first and learn Persian so they could send you to India and be an administrator. So it even outlasted the Islamic power in that region. So the reality is that most urban people in Central Asia prior to the Soviet period were perfectly bilingual. You know, so to call them a Tajik or an Uzbek or Kyrgyz or whatever, it's a completely artificial construct. The term that they used to use was Sart, which probably refers to the merchant class, you know, being involved in business. But this notion of creating nations based on language was a completely Soviet invention, and it was applied by force. And the Tajiks were the great losers in this. It cut them off from their shared heritage with the Persian speakers of Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Iran, and elsewhere. And it was a huge loss for the Tajiks, not to mention the fact that their major cultural centers, Samarkand and Bukhara, were given to a state, the Uzbek SSR, which was established on this somewhat, well, I think ridiculous notion of an Uzbek national identity. So that damage is still in place. I mean, the repercussions are still there. And I think that Uzbeks are as much impoverished by it as Tajiks are. And as a Canadian, coming from a country where language issues threatened to tear the country apart as recently as 20 years ago between the French and the English with their different histories, I'm happy to say that thanks to Trudeau Père, the father of the present Prime Minister, back in the 1970s, the policy of making Canada a truly bilingual country with both languages on absolutely equal footing, and both communities absolutely equal in terms of their rights, which was not the case prior to 1970. Right? The power was in the hands of the English. The French had nothing. So to give to the French speakers of Canada absolutely equal status and rights, and you can see it now in any government dealings. If the Prime Minister makes a speech, if he says 3 sentences in French, then he has to say 3 sentences in English, and so on and so forth. You know? If you go to a post office in the most remote English village and ask for service in French, they have to give it to you. And it saved the country, and we're all the richer for it. So I don't know if Uzbekistan and Tajikistan might one day accept to become bilingual societies on an official level. I think that to do so would first of all be to show respect to their own past, which is very much a bilingual past for 1,000 years, and it would also enrich their societies today. But nobody from those governments has sought my opinion or input on that question, so we'll just have to see.
Other questions?
Excuse me, could you please comment on the role of Islamic Republic of Iran in the current development of Tajikistan? It's a very interesting issue, and I would like to hear your comments on this topic.
Well, again, the case that I make is that the Tajiks and the Iranians are essentially the same people with the same culture that have been politically divided, but in a way that has, you know, separated them and created ongoing differences. So, of course, it was quite natural that after the fall of the Soviet Union, Turkey started trying to exert a lot of influence in the Turkic-speaking republics, come in as a sort of big brother, and we're going to help you learn to be capitalists and help you, you know, come into the modern age and everything. That didn't go over very well. I mean, the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz and the Kazakhs and the Turkmens and the Azeris, they really didn't like being treated that way by the Turks. So the Iranians, of course, tried to do the same thing in Tajikistan, which again was quite natural because of the common language and the common history and culture. And I could say that their efforts were even more of a failure than Turkey's, because not only you had this issue that nobody likes being treated, talked down to. People don't like to be treated as an inferior, like you're there to help them onto their feet. Well, did I ask for that? It's a bit insulting. But apart from that, of course, since the Islamic Republic of Iran is an officially Shiite state, and Tajikistan, with the exception of the Ismailis and Badakhshan, is almost entirely Sunni, that was a no-go from the start. There was no way that the Tajiks were going to be open or receptive to Iranian cultural centers that simply propagated Shiite propaganda. If those cultural centers had promoted Iranian culture instead of Shiite culture, I think they might have had a lot more success. I think people would have been a lot more responsive. And even today we see, from time to see, we see cultural cooperation, not at the government level so much, but between cultural organizations in Iran and Tajikistan, because the cultural shared heritage is really highly valued. They love the same poetry, they love the same music, they love the same art, and they have a lot in common. It's the government that screwed it up by just giving this very narrow definition of Iranian identity as being Shiite entity, and they should have known better. They should have known there's no way that could be attractive in Tajikistan.
But on the other hand, Iranians, of course, have helped Tajikistan very much, just by funding, by building, I don't know.
That wonderful tunnel, the Anzab tunnel, which
tunnel, yes, it's one of the.
Which people are afraid to drive through because it hasn't been built very well.
Not very successful, but there was some good funding,
Well, I visited last summer. I visited a center which actually is now on the premises of the former Iranian embassy in Dushanbe.
Yeah.
The embassy, they built a new embassy, and now the old building is being used for transliterations of textbooks, mainly from the Persian alphabet into the Cyrillic alphabet. So they're not translations, they're just taking textbooks from Iranian universities, like for medicine and for engineering and technical fields mostly. And they're putting them into Cyrillic so that Tajik universities can use them and students can study in their own language instead of using Russian textbooks. So that's the goal. And so that is being funded by Iran, and it seems to be a useful effort.
Through Roizeni, Farhangi, it's very important. Organization for just for keeping Tajik culture on a level, There's no funding from the government, and the only funding people can find, writers, scholars.
Abdul Khalil's hospital also. We have a friend who's in charge of Avicenna Hospital, which is...
the Iranian funding is very important. Okay, more questions, please.
Thank you for a very interesting lecture. And I have a question about language, because the question of Persian and Tajik language has been erased, and I hear that the word talks about going back to Arabic script instead of Cyrillic, because with using Cyrillic script in Soviet era, they cut off themselves from that culture. But as migration plays a very important role in Tajikistan, there is answer from the other side. We don't need Persian Arabic script because we go to work in Russia, so we don't need this script. We need Russian because this is the thing which will help us to get a job. So what is your opinion on this matter? Does this idea, the idea of going back to Arabic script has a basis, is rational, or has a future?
It's a good question, and it's obviously a difficult question, because in Tajikistan they've been talking about it for more than 25 years now, and nothing so far. More than 25 years, and nothing so far has happened. I would point out that yes, for 1 million Tajiks, that having the Cyrillic alphabet might help them when they go to Russia. But come on, there's 7 million Tajiks who still live in Tajikistan, and they're not moving to Russia. So, by the same token, you could ask the question: is the fact that their language is written in Cyrillic, is that sort of steering them towards Russia? I mean, if they had more access to the Latin alphabet, for example, if like Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, these countries have switched from the Cyrillic to the Latin alphabet in an attempt to get closer to Turkey and to Western countries, might that not open up more opportunities for Tajiks not to be so completely dependent on Russia? I don't know. I think that's another part of the question. Already back in 1991, I think, when this was very, very much a live issue to change the alphabet back or not, of course, lots of Tajiks, for sentimental reasons, they feel it's part of their culture, and it's very true that you have, even today, Iran and Afghanistan are Persian-speaking countries that use the Persian Arabic alphabet, and the Tajiks are somehow cut off from that. And yet, in 1991, Professor Richard Fry, who was a great Iranologist at Harvard and had just retired and went to Tajikistan to teach at the university, he was invited to an interview on live national television. And they were so excited to have this great American professor talking on television in Tajikistan and everything. And they said, "So we're going to change our alphabet back. What do you think? Isn't it great?" And he said, "No, it's a stupid idea." He said Persian is an Indo-European language. It's not a Semitic language. The alphabet, it's a terrible alphabet for Persian. He said the Cyrillic alphabet, on the other hand, is completely phonetic. So for children learning to read, it makes much more sense to read it in Cyrillic than to read it in Arabic. You're going to increase your literacy or keep a higher literacy. And they got so upset and they shut down the TVs and everything because it was live and they didn't expect he's going to say that, So, I mean, all of these, obviously, there are strong arguments on both sides. And that's why the issue hasn't been resolved.
The very idea to switch to a different alphabet, if I'm not mistaken, was produced by Iranian intellectuals in in
the 1800s, in the 1880s, yes. Mirza Malcolm Khan, who was a government minister, was promoting this, but it never happened, obviously, in Iran.
But it was picked up by
the Ottomans,
Turks, by the Turks.
Yeah, so, by the young Turks, yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to get acquainted with your work on this theme. I wonder, how do you estimate the year of 2003 that announced to be the year of Zoroastrianism? I mean, Tajikistan and maybe the whole sense relation. Thanks.
What exactly is your question?
This idea of government to announce this year to be the year of Zoroastrianism.
Yeah, what do I think about it?
Yes.
I think it's ridiculous because nobody has any idea when Zoroaster lived. I personally think he might have lived around maybe the 13th, 12th century before the Common Era, that is to say a little more than 3,000 years ago. I think he probably lived in southern Kazakhstan, but other people have very different ideas, very different opinions. Some people think that he lived nearly 4,000 years ago. Some people think that he lived 2,000. Actually, Zoroastrians themselves think that he lived about 2,500 years ago, just a little bit before the Persian Empire. I think that's impossible on linguistic grounds, among other things. But that's what the Zoroastrians themselves believe. But Rahman has these advisors who just make stuff up because it's their job, to try to make Tajiks feel good about themselves. So, and then they need these ceremonies because that's how they show government power, And they're doing this all the time. They did it for what is that, Hisar Fortress. They had the 3,000th year of Hisar Fortress. That fortress was built 500 years ago. There may have been a fortress there, earlier than that. They say it was built by Cyrus the Great. It's really, they say whatever they want. But it's, there's very little historical basis for any of it. But they're not the only ones doing that. People always do these things when they're trying to build up a national identity. They invent stuff, Americans grow up hearing stories about George Washington and chopping down a cherry tree and saying he couldn't tell a lie. There's no evidence for any of these things. Just people say whatever they want, and it's all part of, what they teach you in school so that you can feel proud. But as scholars, we really can't confirm these things.
Actually, the Zoroastrian movement appeared in the very end of the 80s in Tajikistan, in the circles of intellectuals, mostly philologists, from the State University and the Academy of Sciences. And there were several groups of Zoroastrians who tried to learn anew the Zoroastrian way of life. And they established connections with Swedish and Australian Zoroastrian communities. And this was why they were banned just in the end of the Civil War. All these communities, Zoroastrian communities, were banned very severely.
Well, Islamists also murdered a bunch of them, and that kind of was discouraging for a lot of people.
But so, more questions?
Could you please comment on the participation of people of Tajikistan in organizations like ISIS? It's a very, very important topic as the situation in the country, I guess, partly led to increasing quantity of people from Tajikistan participating in such rebellious groups. Could you please comment on that?
Well, I think I suggested in my talk my view on that. The state simply does not provide much to the young generation in the way of opportunities or even hope for opportunities. You have tens of thousands of people now with university degrees who can't find jobs. So in contrast to the state, which talks and talks and talks but doesn't give them anything, you have these Wahhabi groups funded from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar. They come with lots of money, and they do building projects, and the imams are preaching to the younger generation that we really care about you. You really are valuable. So they're getting the message from these Wahhabi groups that they are not getting from their own government. And if these groups give them some opportunities and seem to be, having more, financial capacity, but also really it's more about motivation and feeling valuable. If you feel that the state is treating you like you're worthless, right? But then you have this religious group that treats you like you really are valuable, of course it's going to be very attractive.
So that's about the idea and belonging to something, yes?
Yeah, belonging, having a purpose, and actually being able to feel like you can make a difference. If you're a university graduate and you try and get into the job market and you realize that there's a complete stranglehold from all these corrupt networks, and if you're not from the right family, you can never get anywhere. You just get hopeless. You feel I can't do anything in this country. But if the mosque environment makes you feel like you can really be valuable and make a difference, then of course that's very validating, and everybody needs that. So as long as the government doesn't provide that, then people are going to be susceptible to being attracted to that, wherever it comes from. It doesn't have to be militant Islam. It could be anything. It just happens that it's these, Gulf Arabs that are going there with all the money and impressing people. And if it were coming from somewhere else, it could have a different result.
Actually, the worst thing is that the ruling elite in Tajikistan now, just at work, they're anti-Islamists. They just invent laws against the Islam and just against radical Islam, on the one hand. But on the other hand, when they come back home, they live a radical way of life. So in their minds, they're radical Islamists, the same persons, just who are fighting with radical Islam on the official level. I witnessed myself.
And of course, when the government is so obviously corrupt and so obviously doesn't have the interests of the population in mind, then anybody who criticizes the government can have an audience. So insofar as the Islamists criticize the government for not being real Muslims, that can be an attractive discourse. But again, it could be something else. I don't think that there's anything specifically about Islam that is attractive to young people. I think it's just that they need an alternative. They need an ideology, they need leadership, and they need a sense of purpose. And the Islamists are giving them that. Nobody else is.
And the sense of justice.
The sense of justice. That's of course a great, that's because of course when you live in an unjust society and people talk about justice, even if they don't really mean it. I don't know how much justice was given out by Daesh in Iraq and Syria. I mean, they call it justice. I think most people don't. But just the idea of it, that can be attractive.
So, more questions? Actually, I have a question. What is your opinion? So, we have the end of the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. And Tajiks were very much active politically. I mean, not only intellectuals and I don't know, just those who were in government or just in the governmental structures, but I mean mostly just common people. People came from countryside, from many distant corners of the republic, just to participate in political clashes in Dushanbe. And suddenly, now we have in 2000s an absolute indifference, to politics at all. People don't want to read newspapers, don't want to watch political political programs at TV and so on.
I think
for me, it's almost inexplicable.
Well, I think the Civil War broke their spirit. I mean, the Civil War was a horrific trauma. It affected just about everybody in the country, and it lasted 5 years. And it, I think, destroyed whatever hope people had or faith people might have had in the possibility of a political system. Especially given the outcome. And I think that ever since 1997, the population has lived in a state of fear that it might happen again. And the president very much exploits that. You see these posters all over the place. The subtext is, if you don't keep me in power, it's back to the Civil War. That I'm the one who's guaranteeing your peace and safety. That's very much the gist of his legitimacy. And it seems to be working because people really don't want to go back to the 1990s, no matter what. They can still remember.
And what is your idea? How long can it continue?
That's a very good question because Rahman is not that old and he's already grooming his son to succeed him.
Yes.
And you know, there was a play that was produced in Dushanbe last year where basically about somebody very much like President Rahman, somebody very, very similar to him. And in the play, there were characters that were referring to him as Padshah.
Oh,
Yeah. So I think it's pretty clear how he that he sees this as a kind of monarchy that he intends to turn into a dynasty. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be much that can challenge him. I really don't know. It's difficult to see a way out of this situation. I was talking to one Tajik colleague who lives outside of Tajikistan, and he suggested that one possibility is that the children of the elites are having opportunities to study overseas in foreign universities, and they're getting exposed to other ideas and other ways of life, and that maybe in another generation, when these people come back and they're the ones in power, that maybe they'll have some different ideas than because let's face it, the people who are in control of the country now, they're products of the Soviet system. They're still the products of that way of thinking. So if a new generation comes, even the children of the present rulers, if they acquire a different way of thinking than the Soviet mentality, then yeah, maybe they'll bring about some changes, but it won't happen very soon. And in the meantime, well.
And I have one more question. Just what is how mutually influential are Afghan Tajiks and Tajikistani Tajiks? Do you have any idea about this? So we know that in Afghanistan we have a very active Tajik community, and it's very active not only in Afghanistan but in the West as well. And they are mostly highly educated persons. I mean, Afghan immigrants. And they also just identify themselves as Tajiks. And probably they insist on this more than just Tajikistani Tajiks.
Yeah. Well, there are more of them. There are more Tajiks in Afghanistan, probably twice as many Tajiks in Afghanistan as there are in Tajikistan.
Yeah, and do you see any just mutual influence or just a possibility of such an influence, or what just?
Well, sadly, Afghanistan is the only country in the region that's even worse off than Tajikistan. So, I mean, Tajiks and Tajikistan can always say, well, everything is really horrible here, but at least we're not in Afghanistan, It's still better than that. But about the intellectuals, you're right, that there is an intellectual presence of an intellectual, political, cultural presence of Tajiks from Afghanistan outside of Afghanistan. And I gave a lecture in London last week at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and it was a huge packed audience, which I didn't expect at all. And it was probably 100 people, and they were all Afghan Tajiks, all of them, and all men. They were all men. The Tajiks from Tajikistan, they don't have this presence in the West. It's interesting. I discovered very recently that there is a Tajik Cultural Society of Canada. I mean, I've been researching Tajiks for years. I never knew this society existed in my own country. And the president lives in my city, in Montreal. I didn't know this. Yeah, so how come they're not visible? How come even somebody who studies Tajiks doesn't know that they exist, you know? Because I don't know what they do in this cultural society, if they just meet each other or whatever, but they're not having any visibility in the broader society the way that the way that the Afghans are. In terms of cultural exchanges, I don't know. There's a Persian literary magazine that you might have heard of or be aware of, Bukhara. It's edited by Ali Debashi, published in Iran for a number of years now. And it's very, very highly respected in Iran. All of the great writers publish stories and articles in this journal. And they've had a lot of activities together with Afghanistan and Tajikistan. They have organized cultural events, discussions of literature and things like that in Dushanbe, in Kabul, Mazar-e-Sharif, and Herat. So these kinds of things do exist sort of within today's Persian-speaking world. But let's remember, you know, because we're living in an ivory tower, right? We're all university people, and you know that when you go into town, you know, people look at you like, okay, you're just, you know, not living real life. You're living, you know, the life of a student or a professor. You don't actually have to face the reality that we do. So there's a kind of separation between what happens amongst intellectuals and what happens in the broader society. So you were talking about the movement in the 80s and you know, in Tajikistan, but you know, wasn't it mostly intellectuals? I mean, and how much does what happens and is said amongst intellectuals, how much does it really affect or communicate with the society as a whole? I mean, I'm not sure. You know, the United States is like the world's leader in cultural production for so many years now, and look at the government the people elected. And that tells you something about the general population. The general population that voted for this government, they're not the people that are producing great works of literature and cinema and, you know, all the things that we associate with culture. So there's a lack of communication there. And I think it's true in all countries to some extent.
No, actually we can judge by the number of the copies of, I don't know, political newspapers or something like that. You know? And the numbers tirage was very high.
In Tajikistan.
In Tajikistan, very high. And I think two places in the end of the 80s, Kazakhstan and Tajikistan were the most active in anti-communist propaganda, just organizing meetings, demonstrations against the government and so on. Okay. So, please, the last question, I think.
I want to ask also about languages, because I heard such an opinion that in Soviet times, national elites in different Soviet republics, they... I'm sorry that I was sitting. That's not good for my side. So the opinion is that Soviet elites and Soviet intelligence in national republic in either in Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, or Tajikistan, they preferred I'm talking about intelligence. They preferred Russian to speak and communicate in Russian, not in their national language, not because of their were made speak Russian, but because they said that Russian had. I don't want to say is better than their national language, but they said, I heard that some Tajiks said this, that have more opportunities to express their thoughts. Of course, I agree that Persian is a great language in terms of its the beauty of it, of course, Persian literature, Persian poetry, but they preferred Russian because it gave them more opportunities to express their thoughts, and they preferred to communicate in Russian. Am I right? Just
Are you asking Professor Shakurov or you or both of us?
Because you're the opinion of both, if it is possible.
Well, I think it might be generational to some extent. Obviously, the older generation were educated in Russian, so they're more comfortable in the language of their education. And when it comes to expressing more complex thoughts, you know, if you have a university education in Russian and a primary school education in Tajiki, then your vocabulary in Russian is going to be bigger than your vocabulary in Tajiki. But the vocabulary exists in Tajiki. So it's a question of education. If the education, the university education, shifts more to Tajiki, then of course people are not going to feel that disadvantage. And so I don't know. It'll be interesting to see with the next generation how that happens. I'm amazed still that most of the academics in Tajikistan, even when they're writing about Tajik history or literature or these things, they prefer to write in Russian rather than in Tajiki. And in fact, they almost never write in Tajiki. And I've asked people about that. I say, why don't you write in your own language about your own culture and history? Why do you write in Russian? And you know, one colleague told me, if I write a book about Tajik history in Russian, I have 800 million readers. But if I write in Tajiki, I have, 8 million readers. And I said, well, first, I don't think there's 800 million people reading in Russian. It might be more like 200 million, but 250 maybe. But moreover, those people are not interested in Tajik history. Let's be honest. They're not going to read that book, Whereas if you write a book about Tajik history in Tajiki, then maybe all 8 million are going to be interested. I just think that they're not really thinking about it in a realistic way. They don't understand that, let's face it, apart from this elite group here in Moscow, in this room, I don't know how many people in Russia really want to read a book about Tajik history. But in Tajikistan, potentially everybody would be interested. But it's this mentality, it's what they're comfortable with. And it takes at least a generation to change. I can tell you that just based on my own experience, Tajikistan is far ahead of the other former Soviet Central Asian republics in this respect. I mean, you go to Kazakhstan or Kyrgyzstan and you almost don't hear the native language, I mean, Russian is still very much the dominant language, whereas you go to Tajikistan and you really hear it, And even in Samarkand and Bukhara, if you were walking in the street, mostly you're going to hear Tajiki. But it's not an educated Tajiki, and it's not educated Tajiks necessarily. So it's partly a social class difference as well, and really gets down to the education and the quality of education, which sadly in Tajikistan now is really, really low.
Okay, so
Yeah. I would like to thank you and really apologize for not being able to conduct this in Russian, and I'm pleased and impressed that you're able to give such a welcome to a foreigner who is speaking in a different language, and I hope that надеюсь, что это было понятно.
Это было абсолютно понятно. Thank you. Спасибо.
And thank you for coming.
Thank you.